The morning sun glowed against the towering glass facade of the Linford Corporation headquarters. Nia Linford took a deep breath, gripping the strap of her worn-out backpack as she stared at the building that bore her family name. This was her father's empire, a multi-million-dollar business that had been built over decades. But today she wasn't here as the heiress. Today she was just another employee. She adjusted the oversized cleaning uniform, the fabric stiff against her skin. Her father, Richard Linford, had insisted on this experiment. "You need to see the truth for yourself, Nia," he had told her. "Not through reports or meetings, but by walking among the people who keep this company running." Nia hadn't argued. She was curious. How did people behave when they thought no one important was watching? Did kindness exist in corporate halls, or was it all just a facade for those in power? She was about to find out. Pushing through the entrance, she was met with the usual morning rush. Employees bustling about, heads buried in emails, voices blending into an indistinct hum. She kept her head down as she approached the front desk, where an older woman with silver-streaked hair and sharp eyes glanced up. "You must be Nia," the woman said with a polite smile. "I'm Mrs. Thompson. Mr. Linford mentioned you'd be starting today." "Yes, ma'am," Nia replied, forcing herself to remain composed. "Follow me." As they walked through the pristine hallways, Nia could feel the curious stares. To them, she was invisible, yet interesting enough for a second glance. Finally, they reached the janitor's supply room. Mrs. Thompson handed her a mop and a bucket. "This is where you start," she said. Then, raising an eyebrow, she added, "Welcome to reality." Nia simply nodded, ready for the challenge ahead. Nia's first morning as a cleaner was a lesson in invisibility. As she moved through the offices, pushing her cleaning cart, she quickly realized that most employees barely spared her a glance. It was as if her presence barely registered in their world. She wiped desks, emptied trash cans, and scrubbed the floors without a single acknowledgement. The only time people noticed her was when she was in their way. It was an unsettling contrast to the world she had grown up in, where her presence commanded attention. But this was exactly what she needed, to see the truth with her own eyes. She was in the middle of cleaning a glass window when a voice interrupted her thoughts. "Hey, new girl!" She turned to see a tall man with slicked-back hair leaning against a desk. His name tag read Bryce Harrison, and from the way people seemed to move aside for him, she guessed he was someone with influence. He looked her up and down with an amused smirk. "You missed a spot," he said, pointing to an invisible stain on the glass. Nia hesitated but resumed wiping, her fingers tightening around the cloth. She could feel the mocking in his voice, the way he seemed to enjoy making her uncomfortable. Just as she finished, Bryce accidentally knocked over a cup of coffee onto the freshly cleaned floor. He clicked his tongue and shook his head. "Wow, such a shame. Guess you'll have to clean that up." A few employees nearby chuckled under their breath, some amused, others nervous. Nia's fingers twitched, but she forced herself to stay calm. This was exactly what she needed to witness, how people treated someone they believed had no power. Without a word, she crouched down and began cleaning up the mess. Bryce smirked, clearly satisfied with his little game. As she wiped up the spill, she noticed another man watching the scene unfold. He sat at his desk, his fingers tapping restlessly against the wood. His name tag read Ethan Carter, and unlike Bryce, he didn't look amused. Instead, his jaw was set, his eyes narrowed slightly. When Nia met his gaze, he gave her the smallest nod before turning away. It wasn't much, but it was enough for her to understand. At least one person in this office had a conscience. The days passed, and Nia quickly learned that Bryce had made her his personal target. Every day, he found new ways to remind her of her place, from deliberately spilling things for her to clean to making sarcastic comments about her speed. He seemed to take pleasure in testing her patience. It wasn't just him either. Some employees followed his lead, laughing along, while others simply looked away. The worst part wasn't the insults. It was the silence of those who knew better but chose to stay quiet. One afternoon, as she wiped down the tables in the break room, Bryce strolled in carrying a bag of dry cleaning. Without a word, he tossed it onto the table beside her. "Take these to the laundry," he said casually. "Make sure my shirts come back crisp and spotless." Nia looked up, her hands gripping the rag tightly. That's not my job, she said, her voice even. A few employees nearby stilled, their eyes darting between the two. Bryce let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. Oh, you've got some spirit, huh? He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only she could hear. Let me tell you how things work here. You do what I say, or life gets a whole lot harder. His tone sent a wave of anger through her, but she swallowed it down. This wasn't about proving herself to him. She was here for a reason, and she wouldn't let a man like Bryce break her resolve. Before she could respond, a voice cut through the room. That's enough, Bryce. Ethan had spoken, his voice steady, his eyes locked onto Bryce's with quiet defiance. She's not your maid. If you want your shirts cleaned, do it yourself. The room fell into stunned silence. Bryce turned to Ethan, his smirk twitching. And what? You're suddenly the janitor's hero? Ethan didn't flinch. I'm just someone who doesn't tolerate bullies. The tension between them was thick, but Nia noticed something shift in the room. A few employees, the ones who had always stayed silent, seemed to straighten their backs just a little. Maybe, just maybe, Bryce's control over this office wasn't as strong as he believed. That evening, Nia sat alone in the supply closet, her back against the cool wall. Her uniform was damp from the water Bryce had dumped on her earlier that day, and her fingers were still shaking from anger. She had expected challenges, but she hadn't prepared for the sheer level of humiliation she had endured in just a few days. It wasn't just Bryce, it was the system. The silent approval of those who looked away, the laughter of those who found amusement in her struggles. She had grown up surrounded by power, but now she understood what it was like to be at the mercy of those who wielded it recklessly. A soft knock on the door pulled her out of her thoughts. She quickly wiped her face and opened it to find Ethan standing there, a bottle of water in hand. I figured you could use this, he said simply. Nia hesitated before taking it. Thanks. She took a small sip, letting the cool liquid soothe her throat. Ethan leaned against the doorway, watching her for a moment. You're handling this better than most would, he finally said. She let out a dry laugh. I don't have a choice. Her voice was steady, but she knew Ethan could see the exhaustion behind her eyes. He nodded slowly, as if understanding something she hadn't said aloud. You do, he said, but you're choosing to stay. That says something. Nia looked at him, studying his face. Ethan was different from the others. He wasn't just kind, he was observant. She wondered if he suspected there was more to her story than she let on. After a few moments, Ethan pushed off the doorway. If you ever need someone to stand up for you, I'm not going anywhere. With that, he walked away, leaving Nia alone with her thoughts. She clenched the bottle in her hands, her resolve hardening. She wasn't here to break. She was here to learn, to expose, and soon to change things for the better. Bryce had made a mistake. He had underestimated her, and that was something he would come to regret. The tension in the office continued to grow. Every morning, Nia arrived early, dressed in her cleaner's uniform, and got to work. She remained quiet, observant, and patient, but Bryce seemed determined to break her. His little games escalated. More spilled coffee, more unnecessary tasks, more degrading remarks. Some employees laughed along with him, while others, like Ethan, grew visibly frustrated. Yet Bryce never crossed a line serious enough for someone to step in officially. It was a careful game of power and control, and he played it well. But one afternoon, he pushed too far. Nia was in the supply closet, refilling a mop bucket, when the door suddenly shut behind her. She turned to find Bryce leaning against it, a smug grin on his face. The space was small, and his presence filled it uncomfortably. You're really stubborn, aren't you? He mused, taking a slow step forward. Most people would have quit by now. Makes me wonder what you're really after. Nia's heart pounded, but she refused to step back. I'm just here to do my job, she said evenly. Bryce chuckled, shaking his head. No, I don't think so. You don't act like a regular cleaner. You're too composed. He reached out, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face, and she stiffened. You know, I could make your life a lot easier if you just... The door flew open, cutting him off. Ethan stood there, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning with anger. Step away from her, he said, his voice dangerously low. Bryce straightened, but didn't move. Relax, Carter. We were just having a conversation. Ethan didn't flinch. That's not what it looked like. His fists tightened at his sides. If I ever see you cornering her like this again, I swear." He didn't finish, but the warning was clear. Bryce scoffed, rolling his eyes, but for the first time there was uncertainty in them. He gave Nia one last look before slipping out of the room. After that encounter, something shifted in the office. People began watching Bryce more carefully, and whispers about his behavior spread. It was subtle at first, employees hesitating before laughing at his jokes, eyes darting between him and Nia whenever he spoke to her. He noticed, and it made him furious. His easy confidence began to crack, and in his frustration, he became reckless. He was no longer just targeting Nia, he was lashing out at anyone who didn't fall in line. But Nia wasn't just enduring anymore. She was fighting back in her own way. She remained composed, never giving Bryce the satisfaction of a reaction. She worked harder, made connections with employees who had once ignored her, and, most importantly, she listened. The stories people shared, the unfair promotions, the employees who had mysteriously quit after conflicts with Bryce, it all painted a clear picture. This wasn't just about her. Bryce had been poisoning this company for years. Ethan wasn't the only one who noticed. One afternoon, Mrs. Thompson approached Nia while she was wiping down the reception desk. The older woman eyed her carefully before speaking. "I know what you're doing," she said quietly. Nia tensed but said nothing. Mrs. Thompson sighed. "You're not just a cleaner, are you?" Nia met her gaze, searching for hostility but finding only curiosity. After a pause, the older woman gave her a small nod. "Be careful. People like Bryce don't go down without a fight." Nia swallowed, absorbing the warning. She had come here to observe, but now it was more than that. She wasn't just watching anymore, she was preparing, and Bryce had no idea what was coming. The breaking point came on the day of the quarterly staff meeting. Every employee was required to attend, including Nia. She stood at the back of the conference room, her uniform crisp but simple, blending into the background. Bryce strutted in like he owned the place, grinning, confident, completely unaware that his time was running out. At precisely 10 a.m., the doors opened again, and Richard Linford, the CEO, stepped inside. The room fell into silence. His presence commanded respect, and every eye turned to him as he took his place at the head of the table. His gaze swept across the employees before finally landing on Nia. A small nod passed between them, silent confirmation that it was time. Bryce, oblivious, cleared his throat. "Sir, I don't mean to question your judgment, but why is the janitor in this meeting?" A few chuckles rippled through the room. Nia remained silent, waiting. Richard folded his hands, his expression unreadable. "That's a good question, Mr. Harrison." He let the pause stretch, tension thick in the air. "Would you like to tell everyone why you think she shouldn't be here?" Bryce smirked. "Well, sir, this is a meeting for executives and key employees, not cleaning staff." Richard tilted his head slightly. "Interesting. So you believe the value of a person is determined by their title?" Bryce hesitated. "Well, no, but—" Richard cut him off. "Then allow me to introduce her properly." He stood, his voice strong, unwavering. "Everyone, meet Nia Linford, my daughter, and as of today, your new CEO." The room exploded into murmurs and shocked gasps. Bryce's smirk vanished in an instant. His face paled, and for the first time, he looked genuinely lost. "What?" he choked out, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard continued as if Bryce wasn't even there. "For the past few months, Nia has been working undercover to assess the integrity of this company, to see who upholds our values and who does not." His gaze finally locked onto Bryce, and what she found was deeply disappointing. Bryce's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The reality was settling in. Everything he had done, every cruel word, every abuse of power had been witnessed by the one person he should have feared most. Richard turned to the employees. "I have received extensive reports on workplace misconduct, toxic leadership, and abuse of authority." He gestured to Mrs. Thompson and Ethan, both of whom nodded. "It is clear that this behavior has gone unchecked for too long." Bryce shot to his feet, panic overtaking his features. "Sir, Richard didn't raise his voice, but his next words were final. "You're fired, Bryce. Effective immediately." Silence. Then, like a dam breaking, the room filled with whispers. Employees who had once feared Bryce suddenly sat taller, while others exchanged looks of relief. Bryce staggered back, disbelief etched on his face. "No, please." Richard didn't waver. "Security." Two guards stepped forward. Bryce tried to argue, but it was useless. The moment their hands gripped his arms, his bravado shattered. "You did this," he spat at Nia, his voice venomous. Nia met his gaze with unwavering calm. "No, Bryce, you did this to yourself." As the guards escorted him out, the weight of his downfall was clear. His reign of cruelty was over, and for the first time since stepping into this office, Nia felt the shift, a new beginning, not just for her, but for everyone who had been forced to endure his rule. The conference room remained silent long after Bryce had been escorted out. The employees exchanged uncertain glances, the weight of what had just happened settling over them like a thick fog. Some looked relieved, while others seemed unsure of what this meant for them. Nia could see the hesitation in their eyes. Would she be just another ruler replacing the last? Would she remember this moment, the power she now held, and wield it justly? Richard turned to face the room, his gaze steady. "This company is built on values," he said, "but over the years, some have forgotten what that means. Leadership is not about fear or control, it's about responsibility, and today we take a step towards rebuilding that trust." He gestured toward Nia. "My daughter has seen firsthand what happens when people believe power is their right instead of their duty. That is why I'm confident she is the right person to lead this company forward." Nia took a deep breath, stepping forward for the first time as more than just an observer. "I know many of you don't trust me yet," she admitted, her voice clear and unwavering. "And that's fair. I walked these halls as someone you thought didn't matter. I saw everything, the kindness, the indifference, and the cruelty. And I promise you, change is coming." She paused, scanning the room. "The people who work hard will be rewarded. Those who exploit others will face consequences. From now on, this company will not just thrive in profits, but in integrity." A murmur rippled through the employees. Some nodded slowly, a few even offered small smiles. Ethan, standing near the back, gave her a nod of approval. She knew this was only the beginning. Trust wasn't given, it was earned. But she was ready. In the days that followed, the company underwent a transformation. Bryce's absence left a vacuum of power, but instead of filling it with fear, Nia sought to rebuild with fairness. She started with the people who had suffered in silence for too long, employees who had been overlooked, dismissed, or mistreated. Promotions were reevaluated, and long-standing complaints were finally addressed. One of the first to be recognized was Ethan. His quiet defiance against Bryce had not gone unnoticed. "I want you to be part of my executive team," Nia told him one afternoon in her new office. He raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "I'm not exactly management material," he admitted. "I just couldn't stand watching him get away with everything." "That's exactly why I need you," Nia replied. "This company needs people who stand up for what's right, not just what's easy." After a moment of hesitation, Ethan nodded. "All right," he said, "let's do this." Others followed. Mrs. Thompson was given a more senior role in overseeing employee relations, and workers who had been ignored for years were finally given the recognition they deserved. Slowly, the atmosphere of the company shifted. Employees began to feel safe speaking up, knowing they wouldn't be punished for it. It wasn't an overnight change, but it was real. But not everyone was happy. In the shadows, those who had once aligned with Bryce watched with unease. Some whispered among themselves, wondering if Nia's reign would be any different. And though Bryce was gone, the echoes of his influence still lingered in the corners of the company. It was late one evening when Nia received the first sign that not everyone had accepted the new order. A small note had been left on her desk. Not everyone forgets so easily. There was no name, no indication of who had written it, just a warning. She held the note in her hands, feeling the weight of the message. Change was difficult, and when power shifted, those who lost it would always seek ways to take it back. But she refused to be intimidated. If Bryce had left behind loyal followers, she would deal with them the same way she had dealt with him, through patience, strategy, and unshakable resolve. That night, she called a meeting with her most trusted employees, Ethan, Mrs. Thompson, and a few others who had stood by her side. "We need to be prepared," she told them. "There are people who will try to resist this change, people who benefited from the old system." Ethan leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "So what's the plan?" Nia smiled, her determination unwavering. "We don't just wait for them to strike. We get ahead of them." She pulled out a file filled with evidence, documents she had gathered while undercover, reports of corruption and unethical practices that had been buried under Bryce's control. We clean this company from the inside out, and we don't stop until every trace of the old corruption is gone. The room fell into silence as the weight of her words settled over them. This wasn't just about Bryce. This was about something much bigger. And for the first time, they all realized this fight wasn't over yet. The storm came faster than Nia had expected. An anonymous report surfaced, accusing her of using her position for personal gain. False claims, clearly orchestrated by those who wanted her gone. But she was ready. Instead of denying it outright, she called a company-wide meeting and addressed it head-on. "I knew change wouldn't be easy," she said, standing before the gathered employees. "I knew there would be resistance. But let me be clear, every decision I have made has been for the good of this company, and I have the proof to back it up." She revealed the buried reports, the suppressed complaints, the unethical dealings that had thrived under Bryce's leadership. The people who don't want change are the ones who benefited from the old system, and I won't let them drag this company backward. The response was immediate. Employees who had once hesitated now stood firmly by her side. Even those who had been uncertain before could see the truth laid bare. Those who had attempted to undermine her realized they had miscalculated. Nia was not just her father's daughter. She was a force of her own. By the end of the week, those responsible for the false accusations were identified and removed. The company, once drowning in corruption, was finally free to move forward. And Nia, no longer an outsider in her own family's empire, had proven that she was not just a name, she was a leader. As she stood in her office, looking out at the city skyline, she felt the weight of the past lift from her shoulders. The battle had been fought, the war had been won, and now the future was hers to shape.